One thing I've noticed a lot lately is that so many people are just sick and tired of diversity. And they are tired of seeing people who aren't white. Yes, this is a very, very real phenomena, and it is really mainstream now. I would say that it's mainstream. I would say racism has now returned to the mainstream. It used to be that if you saw racism or if you saw someone talking like a racist, it was okay, that's bad, we don't tolerate that, blah, 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 blah. And nowadays, you go onto Twitter and there's racism right in front of you. They just throw it right at you. I remember before Elon Musk bought Twitter, going onto Twitter was like going onto Google News. That's what it was. It was like going onto Google News. You went onto Twitter, you searched something, and the first things that you would get was from the mainstream sources. It was from the mainstream outlets. So you searched, I don't know, Mogadishu, and the first thing that you would get is from a story from some mainstream outlet. The first results that you would get would be from ABC, Fox News, ABC, NBC, blah, 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 MSNBC, blah, 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 whatever. And then you would get someone's opinion, and then there would be some open source journalist, and he would give his shtick, and you got the biggest talkers, the most popular talkers popping up, the talkers who got the most attention, or they were the wealthiest, they had the most resources. And Twitter was catering to the mainstream. Now you go on to Twitter, and it's just like how the internet was before it became what it is now, before it became completely controlled like it is now. And back in the day, you went onto Twitter before Elon bought it. You went onto Twitter, and it was completely controlled. And there were a lot of employees working for Twitter strictly to make sure that people didn't say certain things, that people didn't express certain opinions. And then Elon Musk came along and he said, no, no, no. Who the hell are all these people? Why are they working here? Oh, they're here to make sure that people don't break the rules, that people don't go beyond the Overton window. And Elon said, no, 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 you're all fired. Goodbye. And he said freedom. That's what he said. Say what you want. And now you go onto Twitter and everything is there. Everything's on Twitter. So I go onto Twitter now and it's just, I don't even have to search for racist opinions. I don't even have to search for stuff. You go onto Twitter, you are immediately welcomed with racist stuff. And there's a lot of talk against the Jews and against Indians. And that's another thing. That is another thing. Before it was, oh, these damn illegal immigrants, right? That was the biggest thing. That's how it started. Oh, these damn illegal immigrants, these Middle Eastern people, they're ruining the world, they're ruining Western civilization, etc., etc. And now a lot of it is against Indian people. A lot of it is against Indian people. So, and there's a lot of memes about Indians, how they're filthy and their country smells like shit and their food is garbage. And I see it all over the place now. I see it all over the place. And you know what? It doesn't really surprise me at all. Doesn't surprise me in the least bit. And I want to talk about how we got here. I want to give just a brief, I don't know about brief because this video might be long. I don't know. It's probably going to be a long video. This is a long form content channel. I'm not really into shorts. I'm not really into short videos. This video will probably get at most 500 something views, and I'm completely fine with that. I don't really care. This is, like I said, this is a long-form content channel. I like doing long-form content. I like what YouTube used to be. I like the old school YouTube when people would just get in front of a camera and talk. There wasn't a lot of editing. Nowadays, you look at all the videos and it's all just super editing and everything is extremely edited and there's B-roll all the time and no one can just sit down and talk anymore. Everything has to be quickened. Everything has to be super fast, and I'm not here for that. I don't really care. YouTube likes to tell me in the analytics department, 42% of people clicked off after 30 seconds. Doesn't really bother me that much. But I want to talk about how we got here. How did we get to the point where racism is now mainstream? And before Twitter was purchased by Elon, it seemed as if things got back to normal. Because I remember back in 2014, 15, there was this explosion in far right rhetoric online. A lot of it was a psyop. Let's be real here. A lot of it was controlled opposition. But there was a lot of it. You had your Stephen Molyneux's and your Milos, and you had your Amarins, American Renaissance. You had all these different figureheads and organizations. You had all that stuff, and they were becoming very popular. There was this all of a sudden there was this sudden popularity that erupted for these types of people. But their main shtick was talking about illegal immigration, right? They weren't talking about how much they didn't like Indian people or how much they didn't like Jews. They were more into attacking the illegals. And that's how a lot of this stuff begins, right? That's kind of like the gateway into racism. Let's talk about the illegals. And at that point, it seems resourceful and helpful and to some extent harmless, because you're not talking against people because of their race. You're simply going against certain people because they broke the law, right? They broke immigration law and they violated immigration law, and so they should be deported, and that's that. And that's perfectly legitimate if that's all you want to talk about, right? Well, I mean, if that's all you're talking about, that's probably a red flag. But if you want to just keep it at that and not go beyond that and not get into a racial topic, I mean, that's completely legitimate, right? But it doesn't stop there. It continues on. And one thing I notice is that if you look at the figureheads some of the figureheads who are behind a lot of this talk, you'll see that their motivations aren't really just limited to talking about people breaking immigration law. If you look at people like Roy Beck or John Tanton, you will see that these people support abortion. They support Planned Parenthood. If you look at the guy who heads Amarin, I forgot his name, American Renaissance. Who was the guy who started American Renaissance? That guy, if you look at American Renaissance, I mean, they are for Planned Parenthood. They are for abortion. They're for all these things. So it doesn't really just stop with illegal. Jared Taylor. Yeah, if you look at Jared Taylor, I mean, that guy, he's not just for talking about immigration issues. He talks about racial issues and genetic issues. And so in 2014, 15, 16, 17, those years, that window of years, there was this almost sudden explosion in popularity. And so the internet really began to clamp down on this stuff. They really began to censor it. Twitter really began to censor it. They got rid of a lot of these people. And there was an entire team of employees in Twitter whose job it was just to make sure that people did not talk about racism or talk about inappropriate subjects, didn't break the terms of service. And that's why you had all these employees. Well, if you want to just get rid of censorship, and if you want really if you want Twitter to become, or any social media platform to become like what the internet used to be before mass censorship, you have to fire all these employees. There's no point there's no point in having them. They have no purpose there, because you want to get rid of censorship. So Elon Musk comes along and he says, okay, you're all fired. Goodbye. You're out. And now you go onto Twitter, and the first thing I go onto twitter.com. I don't even have to search for it. The first thing I'm getting is, oh, the Jews did this, and I'm getting why India smells like shit and Indians are ruining society, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a reason why this is happening. It's not like people just woke up in the morning and said, oh, I believe in these opinions. I agree with these opinions. That's not how these things work. It's a product. It's a result of, to a great extent, it's a result of partially propaganda, right? But it's also, people just don't believe in propaganda for no reason. People don't wake up and say, oh, I believe in this. I mean, that does happen, don't get me wrong, but that's not usually how things work. So, for example, if America woke up one day, if the American government decided to say, hey, we want to go to war with Russia, I can guarantee you the majority of people hearing that news would say, why? Why should we go to war with Russia? They haven't done anything to us. Now, if the United States government organized, let's say, a false flag attack and did a horrendous, let's say that they got a bunch of Ukrainians, right? Let's say they got a bunch of Ukrainian agents. They brought them to America. They put masks on them. They dressed them up with military fatigues and all that. They gave them some good high-tech weaponry, and they ordered them to, let's say, massacre a shopping mall, like that horrible scene from a certain Call of Duty game, Modern Warfare game. I don't remember which one it was, but it was the No Russian episode that made the news. And I don't remember if it was from Call of Duty or it was from Modern Warfare, I believe. It doesn't matter. But let's say that they tell these Ukrainians to pretend to be Russians, because Ukrainians and Russians, let's face it, they're the same people, right? They're the same people. And let's say that they tell these Ukrainians, speak Russian, and don't speak Ukrainian, speak Russian, as if Americans can't tell the difference. Or can tell the difference. Speak Russian, and then go to a mall and just slaughter a bunch of people. And all the news organizations say 500 Americans were murdered, they were gunned down, and the gunmen were speaking Russian. And this was an attack that was organized by the Kremlin, and we have all this evidence. Then yes, a lot of people in America would say, hoorah, let's go to war. But still, because of the internet, a lot of people would say, no, this is probably a false flag attack, blah, 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 blah. But with that kind of violence, you are more likely to get a lot more Americans on the side of going to war. But if the U.S. government just says, well, they invaded Ukraine, so we're going to go to war, a lot of people are going to be saying, who cares, why? Even the Iran thing. Most Americans don't want to go to war against Iran. They'll say, what did Iran do to us, right? So it's not like people wake up and say, oh, I want to go to war, or I don't like these people. There's something that happens that affects people psychologically that gets them to say, I don't like such and such a people. Something happens, right? There's a bad experience. It's like that infamous interview with Liam Neeson, where he says that a friend of his was physically assaulted by a black guy. And he said that he became a racist. He was kind of a racist for a while, but he said that he learned that was not the right path to take, and he amended his ways, and he no longer thinks in that way. But he said that, and that's how it works for most people. That's how it works for the majority of people. Something happens that affects them. So I remember 10 years ago, not even that, 6, 7, 8 years ago, nobody was talking about Indian people. Nobody was talking online about how, there were people, of course, but I'm talking generally speaking, people were not saying how much they don't like Indians. Well, what happened? Well, I remember back in 2018, I started getting these phone calls all of a sudden. And they were coming every single day. Every single day, I was getting these phone calls. And it would happen multiple times a day. We're talking 3, 4, 5 times a day. It was very excessive. Very excessive. And I would get these calls. And initially, I thought, oh, someone's calling me, right? Because, hey, when someone would call me, it was someone that I knew, or it was someone from some kind of company that I am doing business with, or something like that. And so I pick up the phone and say, hello. And the person on the other line, the person on the other side of the phone call would say something like, hello, sir, let me talk to you about lifetime insurance. I want to talk to you about life. And I'm thinking, this is a scam, obviously. So I hang up the phone. And then hours and hours later, the phone would ring again. And I would pick up the phone. Hello? Hello, sir. I would like to talk to you about lifetime insurance. Would you be interested in lifetime insurance? No. And then the next week, I would get a phone call, and the call would go something like this. Hello, sir. You have been chosen to win an amazing prize. You have been selected by Chase Bank to be eligible to have $10,000 into your account. Or I would get a call, and it would go something like this. Hello, sir. Hello, sir. This is the IRS. We want to let you know that you are being penalized for unpaid taxes. you will be in trouble by the police if you do not cooperate. I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here? And it turns out that tons of Americans have been going through this exact same experience, and it is awful. And it came to the point where I had to put this thing on to select this option on my phone so that the phone would not ring if it was from a scam call or if it was from an unfamiliar number. And tons of Americans have gone through this. And so I started doing more research on this, and I found out that the Indian government, the Indian economy, I should say, makes about $1 billion a year from scams. $1 billion, around $1 billion or so dollars, enters the Indian GDP every year because of Indians in India scamming people and stealing people's money from other countries. They're scamming Americans, they're scamming Canadians, they're scamming everybody. They're even scamming their own people. But billions of dollars are coming into India because of this scamming culture in India. And the Indian government doesn't really do anything about it. Maybe they will raid a scam call room every once in a while just to show, hey, we're doing something, look. But they really don't fix the problem. And the United States government doesn't really do anything, doesn't put any pressure on India to put an end to this garbage because America is in this geopolitical conundrum where India is an ally with Russia, but India is also an enemy with China. And so we don't want to lose India because India would make a great proxy against the Chinese because the Indians and the Chinese have this territorial dispute over 2 pieces of territory that no one really gives a damn about. And so we don't want to lose that. We don't want to anger the Indians in any way because if we anger them enough, maybe they're going to go completely on the side of Russia. We don't want to lose them. And there's all this bullshit with Pakistan because Pakistan is an ally with China. So if Pakistan gets out of hand, we may want to use the Indians against them. So there's all sorts of garbage, right? And the scammers are also coming from Pakistan. I think Bangladesh also. That whole Indian subcontinent. It's just filled with scammers. But America doesn't do anything about it. And people had enough. And eventually people just are pissed. That's just the bottom line. So because every single day they're getting these annoying phone calls and it's some guy who sounds like the dude from The Simpsons. And they don't want to hear that. So here's the thing is that these negative experiences become associated with the race of the people who caused those negative experiences. And that's what happens. It's the same thing with, and I hate to say this, but it's the truth. It's the same thing with African Americans. A lot of people say, hey, I don't want to live in a neighborhood full of African Americans. And you say, well, why is that? Well, because of high crime rates. And that's a problem. And they are African American conservatives. They're black conservatives who completely acknowledge this. And they talk about this all the time. They talk about the problem with excessive crime rates in African American areas. And so somebody gets robbed, somebody gets accosted, somebody gets mugged, whatever. And so it becomes, the problem is that those negative experiences become associated with and synonymous with the race of the perpetrators. And that's the problem. Here's the problem with racism is, yes, people go through negative experiences because of particular people from particular demographics, particular nations, nationalities, races, whatever you want to call them. The problem is that when enough anger builds up, that anger is used against the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's used against all the members of that particular race, and that's the problem. So, for example, you had 9/11. After 9/11, you had this surge in anti-Middle Eastern racism. It was awful. There was a lot of it that went on. A lot of it that went on. There was violence. There was just terrible statements that were made against people, threats that were made against people, and they attacked innocent people. People would attack innocent people because they were Middle Eastern. It's awful. And that is the problem with racism. The problem is that it creates a mob mentality. Another problem is that you have these issues that come up, and let's say the issue is Indian scam callers or Pakistani. Let's just say Indian because they're all from the Indian subcontinent. And Pakistan, is that really a real country? It didn't really exist until the late 1940s, so who really cares? Let's just say Indians, right? Here you have this problem: Indian scammers. Now, is every single Indian a scammer? Obviously not. There are Indians in India who are against the scammers. There are Indians in India who get scammed by Indian scammers. So, is every single Indian a scammer? Obviously not. The problem is that you have so many people who go through negative experiences with Indian scammers that they begin not to like Indian people. If the problem with scam calls coming from India was solved, then it wouldn't be so much of an issue. And you would be able to curb the rise of racism against Indians. The problem is that the problem with Indian scammers is not solved. And so what ends up happening is you have the people who go onto Twitter and they make jokes or they make memes or they make very vicious comments about Indian people. And then those comments become popular because people go online and they say, hey, this guy gets me. Hey, this is exactly what I went through, blah, blah, blah. And so that type of stuff becomes popular. That type of opinion becomes more prevalent. And then it eventually, it eventually widens the Overton window, and then people mainstream it. And that's what ends up happening. And so that's how this whole thing really, really begins. A lot of this stuff really began after 9/11. A lot of this trend that we are currently seeing, it began after 9/11 with racism against Middle Eastern people. After 9/11, there was this movement that popped up called the counter jihad. Now, the counter jihad, it existed in its embryonic state before 9/11 in the 1990s. My father was a pioneer behind the whole thing. He was really the first convert to Christianity from Islam who really began talking about Islam on the internet. And my dad started out when the internet was a very, very young thing for the public. It was a very new phenomenon for the public. And so what eventually happened was it was, believe it or not, Sam Shamoun. My father and Sam Shamoun and a few others were talking about Islam on the internet before 9/11. Yeah, a lot of people are watching Sam Shamoun now, and he's become kind of a big thing in the apologetics world on the internet. But a lot of people don't realize that Sam Shamoun has been around for a long time, and he started out in the 1990s with my father. And when I was a very little kid, Sam Shamoun stopped by our house one time. Yeah, and I was a very, very little kid, so. Yeah, Sam Shamoun goes back a long ways, before 9/11. That's how dedicated this guy has been. Even before 9/11, even before talking against Islam became a trend, became a shtick, became basically, I want to say, kind of a racket. Sam Shamoun was on it. He is a very sincere person. And so 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, our lives completely changed. And my father, overnight, became this celebrity. He was on Fox News, CNN, whatever, BBC, all the big media outlets. But you see, my father never wanted the discussion about the problems with Islam to be a secular one where anti-Christian views are advanced under the guise of fighting against Islamic beliefs. But it eventually became that. And it became that fairly quickly after 9/11. 9/11 opened up this whole market for talking against Islam. And what happened was it went from being a movement where you had converts to Christianity from Islam talking about the dangers of Islam to atheists like Sam Harris and Dawkins and Hitchens talking against Islam and promoting things like Skittles, promoting the Alphabet Mafia under the guise of going against Islam. So it went from being a discussion where people would say things like, hey, Islam is evil, it's a demonic religion, it's satanic, I left Islam, I found Jesus, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, Muhammad is Antichrist. It went from that to, hey, Islam is against Skittles, Islam is against Sodom. So if you are against Islam, then you should be for Sodom. And if you're for Sodom, well, you're basically a Muslim. I mean, that's what the discussion eventually ended up as. That's what the discussion eventually shifted to, and it became extremely obnoxious, extremely obnoxious. And then it really metastasized into this discussion on immigration, and that happened very quickly. Immigration, and that went from talking about immigration from Muslim countries or Middle Eastern countries to, well, the IQ differences between Middle Eastern people and white people. And that whole IQ discussion really exploded in, I want to say in 2014, 2015. That's when it really became quite noticeable. And then it really went off in 2016, 2017 during the beginning of the Trump era of America. And it became eugenics. And it became eugenics. And I knew it's not gonna stop at Muslims. It's gonna go to other people. It's gonna go to just African people. It's gonna go to other people. It's not going to stop at just Islam. They're going to attack other people. And you see it already. You see people hating on Indians. They're not Muslim. And you also see a lot of people hating on Jews. And I've talked about this before, but after 9/11, there began this phenomena of hating Jews. Now, after 9/11, it was still very fringe. It was not mainstream. It wasn't a big thing. But the seed was sown and it was germinating after 9/11, because there began this conspiracy that said the Jews, or that Jews were behind 9/11, or that Israel had a hand in 9/11. And that conspiracy really set off because of the dancing Israelis story. And this is a true story, by the way. During 9/11, during the actual attack, when it was happening, the buildings were going down, the whole thing. During the 9/11 attack, there was this lady who was in her apartment, and she looked out the window and she saw a group of men dancing on a roof. And they looked kind of Middle Eastern. So, hey, 9/11 is going on. I see people dancing. They look kind of Middle Eastern. I'm going to assume that these guys are Muslim. So she calls up the police and she says, hey, I'm seeing Middle Eastern looking men dancing. Now, this is during 9/11. So the cops were probably thinking, we are on this. Oh, we're on it. So eventually these dancing guys, they get arrested. And it turns out they're all Israeli. And it turned out that a number of them were Mossad. This is not, that point is a fact. What I just said, it's not a conspiracy theory. This actually happened. And it turned out that a number of them were Israeli intelligence. And the question is, why were they dancing? Now, they said the reason why they were dancing was because they realized at that point that America was finally going through what Israel had been going through for years. And now, this is the reason that they give. Now America is going to start acting against Islamic terrorism. And that America would finally be an ally with Israel against Islamic terrorism. That's the reason that they gave. That's what they said. That was their argument. But still, why are you dancing at a time when people are dying? This is like if I was in Israel, let's say I was in Tel Aviv, and I started dancing and laughing, hearing about the October the 7th massacre. And then I say, well, now I'm dancing because now I know that Israel is going to destroy Hamas. But still, why would you be dancing and laughing? And you're Mossad. What are you doing in New York City during 9/11 dancing? This is like if a group of Americans were found dancing in Tel Aviv and it turns out that they were CIA. I mean, that would make you very suspicious. What are you guys doing? What's happening? And then we see the effect of 9/11. What happened after 9/11? Well, immediately there was talk about Iraq. Immediately there was talk about Iraq. And then you find out, wait a second, they were talking about invading Iraq before 9/11. But people like Condoleezza Rice, George Bush, and all that, they were not enthusiastically expressing any desire to invade Iraq. In fact, I think Condoleezza Rice herself said that she was not interested in a war to overthrow Saddam Hussein before 9/11. After 9/11, the tone changes. Before 9/11, Israel was pushing the United States to invade Iraq. Ariel Sharon wanted America to overthrow Saddam. Netanyahu wanted the United States to overthrow Saddam. And America wasn't doing it because, well, where's the pretext? If America is going to do a major war to enact regime change, there needs to be a major pretext. There needs to be a major justification. Well, at that point, there wasn't any. But then 9/11 happens. Thousands of Americans die. You have Americans, young American men, lining up by the droves to join the U.S. military. Now America had its pretext. And then all of a sudden you see America talking about invading Iraq, and eventually you see America invading Iraq, which is what Israel wanted. So then people start trying to explain the reasoning behind the madness. You see dancing Israelis. They were members of Mossad. Mossad is Israeli intelligence, very high tech, very organized, very serious intelligence agency. And they have networks all over America. And they're dancing in New York City at the time of the 9/11 massacre. And Israel was pushing for an invasion of Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. These terrorists were Saudis. These were Saudis. And all of a sudden we see talk about invading Iraq, which again had nothing to do with 9/11, but it was something. The invasion of Iraq was something that Israel wanted. So people start looking at the effect. And then they start asking that question, what's the question? I think it was Mussolini who asked, "Cui bono?" Who benefits? If you look at who benefits, then you can see who was behind something, right? This is the reasoning that a lot of people have. I'm not saying that I believe this, but this is what people are saying. And so there was this but there was this inchoate stage of the beginning of anti-Semitism in the world. In the Western world, that is. And that was to say that Israel and the Jews had a hand in 9/11. And then they read about, I don't know, how some guy who was Jewish, who had who partially owned or was partially leasing out the Twin Towers, and how he would have breakfast every single morning, really early in the morning. But then on the day of 9/11, he just so happened not to be having breakfast. And there was a lot of insurance money that was paid. And all these different details and facts and all that get put together and into an argument. And this is how a lot of this stuff began. So, but after 9/11, it was just hatred on Middle Eastern people. I mean, it was open season on Middle Eastern folks. There was a war in Iraq. It was open season on the Middle East. You could have done anything, and people would have supported it. And people would have supported it, absolutely. So they go right into Iraq. They do this war. And what happens? What happens is you have a migrant crisis that blows up, because all the violence that happened in Iraq eventually boiled over into Syria, and then you have the Syrian civil war, and it causes this massive migrant crisis. And you have millions of people leaving Syria. You have 1 million people going into Europe, going into Germany especially. Tons of people going into Turkey. Turkey absorbed the majority of the Syrian migrants. Germany absorbed the second largest body of Syrian migrants. And what does that do? Well, you have stories of migrants doing certain crimes, and these stories blow up. And then people go through negative experiences. They go through traumatic experiences because they were attacked, or they were accosted, or somebody was sexually assaulted by a migrant. And these stories become major headlines. And then all Syrian migrants all of a sudden are seen as terrorists. All Syrian migrants are seen as ISIS. All Syrian migrants are seen as sexual predators and rapists. And like I said, the good, the bad, and the ugly have to receive the hatred. And that's the problem when you have mob anger and violence. It's very indiscriminate. It doesn't care. It doesn't look at who's the perpetrator, who's the innocent one. it wants to kill everyone, and that's the problem. Even in the Bible, there is discrimination when it comes to killing. You could read in the Old Testament where it says, get rid of all the Canaanites, but then you read about King Saul killing the Gibeonite Canaanites, and then God punishes Israel. And later on, God is asked, why is Israel being punished? I believe it was punishment with a famine or a pestilence. I don't remember, but God punishes all of Israel. And God is asked, why is Israel being punished? And God says, because of what King Saul did to these Canaanites. So even God has discrimination. God doesn't believe in just butchering people unjustly or butchering people just outrightly. There has to be a reason. Even Abraham said, when Abraham saw God in the form of a man, and Abraham saw Jesus Christ, and so that's why I say Abraham spoke to Christ. That's why Jesus said, Abraham saw me, and the Jews freaked out when he said that. But Abraham, when he saw God in the flesh, he said, God, if there's just 10 righteous people in all of Sodom, would you destroy it? And he said, no, I wouldn't. But when it comes to mob violence, there is no discrimination. It's indiscriminate. And that's why you can tell Israelis about war crimes done in Gaza, not just in the current war, but you can tell them about war crimes that were done during Cast Lead or during Operation Pillar of Defense or Protective Edge. And they don't care. A lot of them don't care. They'll say, well, it was a war. Who cares? Those people are all terrorists. We don't really differentiate between child and adult. And a lot of people think that way. A lot of people do. And that's the problem. And so what happened in Europe was you had a surge in popularity for right-wing parties. Now, it wasn't a surge in the sense that they all just dominated their respective parliaments, but it was a surge in the sense that they reached a point of popularity that they had never reached before. Marine Le Pen has reached immense amounts of popularity in France now. She won the first round of elections in France. There has to be a second round, I believe, on July 7th. But she won the first round of the first of the two rounds for the French elections, which is a very, very big deal. The AfD is dominating politics in Germany. You have the Freedom Party in Austria. You have the Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands. All these parties reached a point of immense popularity, and they reached a mainstream space in their respective countries because of the migrant crisis. That's what caused it. I think if these governments said, okay, we can't take in that many people, then this surge would not have happened. That's my guess. It would not have happened. But they did it, and they knew what the effects were going to be. They're not stupid. Merkel wasn't a stupid politician. I remember when Merkel first got elected, it was back in 2008 or 2009, and I'll never forget it. I was in the hospital visiting my grandmother, and I was watching the news, and I saw the news, and it talked about Angela Merkel becoming Chancellor of Germany. And it was talking about how Angela Merkel said multiculturalism doesn't work, it's a failure. She knew that multiculturalism eventually doesn't work, but she still pushed for it in 2014, 2015. And she said her infamous German line, which I don't remember in German, but in English I do. It was, we can do it. We can do it. I don't know how you say that in German, but, we can do it. She all of a sudden became pro-multiculturalism when she knew that it was a failure. So why did she do it? I think, this is me putting on my conspiracy theory hat, but I think that there is a conspiracy at hand. And I've talked about this many, many times. I think that there was a conspiracy done by NATO to revive nationalism in Europe. That's my opinion. That's my opinion. Because if you look at what the CIA was doing during the Cold War, they were pushing for nationalism in Europe. And the way that they did that was doing false flag attacks in Europe and then blaming those terrorist attacks on the left and on the Soviets in order to get people to become far right, and that's why they backed nationalist paramilitaries, neo-Nazi paramilitaries, and there were various acts of horrendous violence that were done in Europe during the Cold War. For example, there was what is known as the Brabant killings in Belgium, where you had people walking into random grocery stores and shooting people with shotguns. In Italy, you had the Bologna massacre in the 1980s, in which you had dozens of people who were butchered by a massive bomb in a plaza near it was a place for farmers to get the pay for selling their produce, something like that. But they did it right in a plaza in the city of Bologna, and dozens of people were butchered. And then they tried to blame it on the Soviets or on leftists who were pro-Soviet. And there was a lot of weird things like that was going on in Europe. And it was all false flag attacks, and it was all done for the purpose of bringing in nationalism in Europe. So then you see this giant migrant crisis, which was not the result of something that Russia did. It was not the result of something that China did. It was the result of something that NATO did. It was the result of this civil war that the United States encouraged and that the United States backed and prolonged by arming and training rebels. And it was something that NATO did when they launched this campaign against Libya by overthrowing Gaddafi. It destabilized Libya, destabilized that North African country, and that's why you had a lot of Libyans trying to cross the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, to get into Europe. It was absolutely awful. And if they had simply just left people alone, if they had simply just left Gaddafi alone, left Assad alone, a lot of this stuff would not have happened. It would not have happened. Let's say there was because people will argue and say, well, they were going to rebel anyway, right? People were going to rebel anyway against Assad. Okay, Bashar al-Assad would have crushed it just like his father did, and that would have been the end of it. And that's that. That's it. But no, they had to get involved. Qatar had to get involved. Saudi Arabia had to get involved. Turkey, which is the second most armed country in NATO, had to get involved. And it just ruined the Middle East. And it caused an entire migrant crisis, the ideological effect of which was the revival of far-right nationalism in much of Europe. And now in Germany, you have a party which is filled with Nazis now acting as a mainstream party in Germany. Who would have thought that could have happened? Who would have thought? But now it's happening. This is how surreal our world is. But a lot of this stuff goes back to 9/11. That's why I trace it back to 9/11. A lot of this stuff goes back to 9/11. Now, I'm sure you can trace it. I know that you can trace it before 9/11. You could bring up, I don't know, the arming of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. You could bring up how arming the Mujahideen led to the formation of a greater Islamist network that the CIA could no longer control. And of course, you could trace it back to that. Absolutely. But if you go back to 9/11, 9/11 was the catalyst for all of this stuff. It was the catalyst for it because 9/11 is what was used to justify the Iraq War. And it turns out that Israel wanted the Iraq War. Israel was pushing for the Iraq War. And so that fact has been used to justify hatred against Israel, hatred against Jews. So there's that. And then absolutely, it started this whole talk against immigrants. It sparked very much so a nativist type of movement in the Western world. And also, another thing that happened after 9/11, like I said, was the formation of the counter-jihad. The counter-jihad was established as an international movement in 2007. And in 2007, what happened was that there was this guy named Philip de Winter. Philip de Winter is he's a Flemish neo-Nazi. He's a neo-Nazi who organized this meeting in the EU Parliament building in 2007. And it was established, this meeting was organized as basically the start of the counter-jihad movement as an international movement. And I think Robert Spencer was there. A number of people were there. But still, this meeting was organized by a neo-Nazi. Now, if you go back to Philip de Winter's past, you will see that he was talking about transforming Europe into a white Europa, getting rid of all of the non-whites. And then also he did this thing where, pretty certain this was Philip de Winter, he did this thing where he went to a Wehrmacht, it was a Wehrmacht grave site, and he was there to celebrate the Wehrmacht and all that. So obviously the guy is a neo-Nazi. Well, what's he doing talking about the dangers of Islam? If a neo-Nazi wants to talk to you about the dangers of Islam, you know damn well that he doesn't really want to stop at Islam. He doesn't want to stop at Middle Eastern people. He's going to go beyond that. He's going to go against black people. He's going to go against anyone who's not white. And eventually he's going to go to the Jewish question. I mean, that's the inevitability, right? That's the inevitable reality of that, is that eventually he's just going to go and talk about the Jews and talk about why the Jews are behind this and behind that and why Hitler was right and all that stuff. That's what that stuff leads to. But the fact of the matter is that the counter-jihad movement was established as an international movement with the help of a neo-Nazi by the name of Philip de Winter. So right there, it shows you that the beginning stage of the counter-jihad movement after 9/11 began as a subversive Nazi movement that was using the threat of Islam as a cover-up to masquerade its true motivations. And you have to ask yourself, why was Robert Spencer hanging out with the Sweden Democrats? The Sweden Democrats was a party founded by Swedish Nazis, Swedish members of the SS. And here you have Robert Spencer promoting them, going to Sweden, hanging out with them, speaking for them, talking good about them on his website. And it makes you wonder, why is that? What's going on there? Because the counter-jihad movement was not founded to just talk about Islam. It wasn't founded to just talk about the threat of Muslims. It was founded as a way to advance racism and eugenics under the cover, initially, of being anti-Islam. So, yeah, that's how a lot of this stuff began. And the train has been set. The train has been set. It's not going to stop. This is going to continue. It's only going to get worse. We're not going to stop this. We're not going to be able to stop this. Elon Musk did not start this. Elon Musk simply gave people who already felt this way the freedom to discuss it on Twitter, on a major social media platform. It's saying that Elon Musk is behind this because he removed censorship from Twitter is like saying that someone throwing bread in a lake is behind the ducks wanting bread. No, the ducks already wanted bread. It's just that the guy was there to give them the bread. It's like the Protestant Reformation. Luther did not really start the Protestant Reformation. He was a catalyst towards it. He became the face for the Protestant Reformation, but he didn't start the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation already began in the hearts of all those who were already more than willing to follow someone like Luther. Luther was simply the man holding the bread. The ducks were already there wanting the bread. So anyway, that's how a lot of this stuff really began. And the train has been set. It's not going to stop. And that's it. It's only going to get worse. And you see it coinciding with militarism, and eventually it's going to just erupt into the world being broken down into various blocks. You already see this sort of thing forming. Europe is going to have its own block of power. China, Japan, these countries are going to be vying for power, and everyone is hating on everyone. A lot of people are just sick and tired of diversity. You have people who are hating on Jews, hating on Indians. You have Indians who are hating on anyone who doesn't support Israel. You have people hating on Russians. You have Japanese people who hate Chinese people, vice versa. It's all just going to erupt into tribalist bloodshed. I remember reading about this this ancient grave site that was discovered. I want to say in Germany, and this grave site, it was a mass grave. It was just a mass grave. It was a pit that was full of dead bodies, the remains of dead bodies, and this grave site, this mass death pit, was aged to be thousands of years old. It was thousands of years old. This thing, an archaeologist discovered it, and they say that it goes back to I don't know, the Neolithic era, something like that. And these people were brutally slaughtered, and their bodies were dumped into this mass grave. And so they concluded that this was the site of a massive war, and these were POWs, an ancient Neolithic war, and these were POWs, and they were butchered, and their corpses were dumped into a pit. Well, mankind hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. People use spears and rocks, and they used iron. They used metal blades. Now we have drones, and we have artillery and tanks and AI military technology, and the technology has changed, but the spirit is still there. The spirit is still there. You're not going to change anything. These decades of peace that we've had since the end of the Second World War are quite unprecedented in the history of human existence. Unprecedented. And so when you see something that's unprecedented, be prepared to go back to how things used to be and what mankind was accustomed to. And that is war. That's tribalism. That's viciousness, violence, and all these things. I wish it wasn't the case, but sadly enough, that is the case. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.